frozen time. The days in Ballygally Castle dragged on like molasses, the oppressive atmosphere seeping into Emily's thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the brightest daylight. By the third night, her exhaustion was palpable, her body aching for rest. But rest in this castle, she was beginning to understand, came at a price. The wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls, carrying with it a faint whistling tune. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Alice was already asleep, curled up on the far side of the room with the covers pulled over her head. The events of the past few days had taken their toll on her friend, leaving her irritable and withdrawn. Emily checked her watch. 2:45 a.m. She sighed, knowing she should try to sleep, but unwilling to close her eyes. The memory of the dream, the shadowy figure in the turret, and the wailing cry of Lady Isabella still lingered. Her gaze flicked to her wrist again. The second hand of her watch ticked forward, its rhythmic movement oddly comforting in the silence. Tick, 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 and then it stopped. Emily frowned, holding the watch closer. The time read 3:17 a.m., the second hand frozen in place. She tapped the glass face, but the watch didn't respond. What the hell? She whispered to herself. A sound broke the quiet, a heavy thud, like the booted step of someone walking across the wooden floor. It came from behind her. Emily's breath hitched as she turned her head slowly toward the sound. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the bedside lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Alice was still asleep, undisturbed. Thud. The sound came again, deliberate and steady, as though someone were pacing. It seemed to move closer, the vibrations faint but tangible under her bare feet. Alice! Emily called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her friend didn't stir. Swallowing her fear, Emily stood and grabbed her phone from the nightstand. She switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. The room appeared empty, but the footsteps continued, circling her like an unseen predator. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking. "Who's there?" The pacing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of Alice's breathing. Emily scanned the room again, her hands trembling as she gripped the phone tighter. Her gaze landed on the wardrobe in the corner, the same wardrobe that had been slightly ajar the night they'd first arrived. Now, its doors were firmly shut. A sudden knock came from inside the wardrobe, a sharp, echoing sound that made Emily jump. She stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her grasp and landing on the floor with a dull clatter. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a faint scraping noise. It sounded like fingernails raking against the wood. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she bent down to retrieve her phone. Her fingers fumbled over the cold screen, and when she finally turned the flashlight back on, she aimed it at the wardrobe. The doors creaked open. Inside, the wardrobe was empty, its dark interior revealing nothing but an expanse of shadow. Emily stared, her breath catching in her throat. She knew she should shut the doors and walk away, but something rooted her in place. Her fear was mingled with curiosity, an inexplicable need to understand what was happening. As she watched, something glinted in the corner of the wardrobe, a faint silvery shimmer. Emily hesitated before stepping closer, her flashlight beam steady on the object. It was a pocket watch, antique and ornate, its chain draped over the wooden rail. The metal gleamed despite the years of dust that covered the wardrobe's interior. Tentatively, Emily reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the watch, a sharp jolt shot up her arm, making her gasp. The sensation wasn't painful, but it was cold, bone-deep, and numbing. She yanked her hand back, and the pocket watch dropped to the floor. The sound of boots returned, this time louder and faster, as though someone were running in circles around the room. Emily spun in place, the flashlight beam darting across the walls. The sound was relentless, pounding against the floorboards with an almost frantic rhythm. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The footsteps ceased abruptly, replaced by a whisper so faint it was almost imperceptible. Emily strained to hear, her head tilted toward the sound. "Time is fleeting," The words sent a shiver down her spine. She turned back to the wardrobe, where the pocket watch now lay on the floor. Its cover had flipped open, revealing an engraved face. The hands were spinning wildly, faster and faster, until they became a blur. Emily backed away, her heart hammering. The room grew colder, the air so frigid that her breath condensed in front of her. She stumbled toward the bed, shaking Alice awake. "Alice, wake up!" Alice groaned, turning over and squinting at Emily through bleary eyes. "What is it now?" "Theirs." Emily hesitated, glancing back at the wardrobe. The footsteps were gone, the whispers silenced. Even the pocket watch lay still. Its hand stopped at 3:17 a.m. The oppressive cold seemed to retreat, leaving the room eerily quiet. "Nothing," Emily said finally, her voice hollow. "It's nothing. Go back to sleep." Alice muttered something unintelligible and rolled over, pulling the covers back over her head. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she stared at the wardrobe. She didn't dare close her eyes. The next morning, Emily awoke to the sound of birds chirping faintly outside the window. She didn't remember falling asleep, but the stiff ache in her neck suggested she had spent most of the night sitting upright. Alice was already up, rummaging through her bag with an air of determination. "We need to leave," Alice said bluntly, her voice tight with frustration. "I can't do another night here." Emily didn't respond immediately. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the night before. She glanced at her wristwatch, noting the time, 3:17 a.m. Her stomach twisted. The hands hadn't moved since the night before, no matter how many times she tapped the glass or adjusted the winding knob. "I think something's keeping us here," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice froze, turning to look at her. "What are you talking about?" Emily hesitated, then retrieved the pocket watch from the wardrobe. Its ornate cover gleamed in the morning light, but the hands remained frozen in place. She held it out to Alice. "This," she said, "it was in the wardrobe last night. I think it's tied to whatever's happening here." Alice frowned, taking the watch reluctantly. "It's just an old trinket, probably planted there for tourists to freak out over." "It stopped at the same time as my watch," Emily countered. "Exactly 3:17 a.m. And the footsteps." "Footsteps?" Alice raised an eyebrow, her skepticism returning. Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "Never mind. Just help me figure out what this means." Alice shrugged but pocketed the watch. "Fine. But if I hear one more creepy thing, I'm leaving, with or without you." As the morning wore on, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that time itself was slipping away. The castle's shadows seemed longer, its corridors darker, as though the sun couldn't quite reach its depths. And somewhere, faint but insistent, the echo of boots on the floor haunted her every step. Clockmaker's curse. The dining hall of Ballygally Castle was steeped in an unsettling grandeur. Its high, vaulted ceiling loomed above like a watchful guardian, and the faded tapestries lining the walls depicted scenes of hunts and feasts that felt unnervingly lifelike. A massive stone fireplace dominated one end of the room, its embers barely glowing, as if reluctant to illuminate the space. In the center of the room stood a grandfather clock, its ornate frame carved with intricate floral patterns and strange symbols. Emily and Alice hadn't noticed it during their first tour of the castle, but now, the clock seemed to demand their attention. Its dark wood gleamed as though freshly polished, and its brass pendulum swung silently, hypnotically. Connor entered the room, his face pale but determined. He carried Michael Shaw's journal in one hand and an old map of the castle in the other. Following close behind him was Maggie Quinn, a self-proclaimed psychic whose arrival at the castle had been as unexpected as it was timely. Dressed in flowing layers of black and with a string of charms hanging from her neck, Maggie was the very picture of theatrical mysticism. "You brought a psychic?" Alice asked, her tone laced with skepticism as Maggie surveyed the room with narrowed eyes. Connor shrugged. "She knows things. Trust me. We need all the help we can get." Maggie ignored Alice's quip, her attention fixed on the grandfather clock. She moved toward it with a slow, deliberate grace, her fingers brushing the air as though feeling for something unseen. "This clock," she murmured. "It's wrong." Emily frowned, stepping closer to the clock. "What do you mean, wrong?" Maggie turned to face the group, her expression grim. "This isn't just a timepiece. It's a vessel, a conduit. Its hands don't measure time. They manipulate it." Connor flipped open the journal, quickly thumbing through the pages. Michael Shaw mentioned a clockmaker in Carrickfergus. He said, he wasn't just a craftsman, he was an alchemist. He built this clock as part of Shaw's experiments with immortality. Alice rolled her eyes. "Great, a haunted clock. What's next? Cursed candlesticks?" Before anyone could respond, the clock's pendulum let out a sharp clang that echoed through the hall. The group fell silent, staring as the clock's hands began to move backward. The clock strikes. The ticking began softly at first, a faint click-click-click that grew louder with each swing of the pendulum. The sound was deep and resonant, like the heartbeat of the castle itself. The hands spun counterclockwise, faster and faster, until they blurred into a golden haze. "I don't like this," Alice muttered, stepping back. "This is straight out of a horror movie." Maggie held up a hand, her eyes narrowing as she studied the clock. "It's trying to show us something," she said, her voice calm but edged with urgency. "Don't look away." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared at the clock face. The symbols etched into the wood seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into unfamiliar patterns. For a moment, she thought she saw a reflection in the brass pendulum, not of herself, but of someone else. A man in a long coat, his face obscured by shadow, stood motionless, watching her. The clock chimed, a deep, resonant tone that reverberated through the room. The air seemed to ripple, and the light in the hall dimmed. When the chime faded, the room was no longer the same. A step back in time. The dining hall now looked as it must have in the 17th century. The tapestries were vibrant and new, and the fireplace roared with life. A long wooden table stretched across the room, laden with platters of roasted meats, fruits, and loaves of bread. Candles burned brightly in ornate candelabras, casting flickering shadows on the walls. At the head of the table sat a man, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight. He was dressed in fine clothing, dark velvet trimmed with gold, and his piercing eyes scanned the room as though he could sense their presence. "Michael Shaw," Connor whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't seem to hear him, but his expression grew darker, his lips curling into a faint sneer. He raised a goblet to his lips, drinking deeply before slamming it down onto the table with a force that made the dishes rattle. Another figure entered the room, a woman. Emily's breath caught as she recognized her from the descriptions in the journal. It was Lady Isabella, her face pale but resolute, her eyes filled with defiance. She carried a bundle in her arms, and Emily knew without a doubt that it was her infant son. "You cannot take him from me," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Michael rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. "You are a fool, Isabella," he said coldly. "The boy is mine. He will carry on my legacy, not yours. You speak of legacies, but all you leave behind is pain." She spat. "He deserves better than to be a pawn in your games." Michael's expression hardened. "And what do you deserve? A woman too weak to see the greater good." The baby in Isabella's arms began to cry, the sound sharp and piercing. Michael's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, reaching for the child. But Isabella turned away, clutching the infant tightly. "No," she cried. "You will not have him." A warning. The room blurred, the scene dissolving like mist in the sunlight. Emily blinked, finding herself back in the modern dining hall. The clock stood before them, its hands once again frozen at 3:17. Maggie let out a slow breath, her shoulders slumping. "The clock remembers," she said. "It's tied to their pain, bound to the tragedy of this place." Connor nodded, his face pale. Michael wasn't just obsessed with alchemy. He was trying to cheat death by binding time itself. This clock, it's a remnant of his experiments. Alice crossed her arms, her eyes darting nervously between the clock and the others. "So what do we do?" Smash it. Maggie shook her head. It's not that simple. Destroying the clock won't undo the damage it's caused. If anything, it might make things worse. Worse? Alice scoffed. How could it get worse? As if in response, the clock let out another chime, its tone deeper and more foreboding than before. The pendulum began to swing again, and the hands moved forward this time, each tick accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. We need to figure out what it's trying to tell us. Maggie stepped closer to the clock, her hand hovering over its surface. The symbols, she murmured. They're not just decorative. They're part of the ritual, binding runes meant to trap time. Connor flipped through the journal, searching frantically for anything that might help. Here, he said, pointing to a page filled with diagrams. Michael wrote that the clock was both a key and a lock. It could open a doorway, but only at a specific moment. A doorway to what? Alice asked, her voice laced with dread. Maggie met her gaze, her expression grim, to whatever Michael Shaw was trying to summon. Trapped. The group first noticed the tourist at dinner, a young man, no older than 25, with an oversized backpack and an enthusiastic grin that stood out in the castle's oppressive atmosphere. He introduced himself as Liam, an exchange student from London, on a solo trek across Ireland. Beautiful place, isn't it? Liam had said, his voice light and cheerful as he gestured toward the gloomy dining hall. Heard it's haunted too. Thought I'd give it a go. Love a good scare. Alice had snorted, muttering something about tourist cliches, while Connor gave Liam a polite nod before returning to Michael Shaw's journal. Emily, however, couldn't shake the feeling that Liam's presence disrupted the fragile balance of the castle. It was as though he didn't belong here, not in a place soaked in so much grief and malevolence. Liam was oblivious to their unease. That night, while the rest of the group huddled in the library, piecing together fragments of Ballygally's dark history, Liam wandered off, his curiosity leading him through the castle's twisting corridors. The discovery: the hallway was colder than the rest of the castle, its air thick with the scent of damp stone and something metallic. Blood, perhaps. Though Liam dismissed the thought with a nervous chuckle, his footsteps echoed as he explored, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. It was sheer luck, or perhaps fate, that he stumbled upon the hidden door. He had leaned against the wall to adjust his backpack when a section of stone shifted under his weight with a soft click. The sound startled him, and he stepped back as a portion of the wall slid inward, revealing a narrow passageway shrouded in darkness. Cool, Liam murmured, his excitement overriding his better judgment. He ducked through the opening, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The passage was cramped, the walls pressing close on either side, and the air grew colder with every step. At the end of the passage, he found himself in a circular chamber unlike anything he'd seen before. The walls were lined with shelves, each crammed with clocks of every shape and size. Grandfather clocks stood like sentinels in the corners, their faces cracked and their pendulums stilled. Mantel clocks, pocket watches, and even small alarm clocks cluttered the shelves, their hands frozen at different times. The silence in the room was unnerving. Liam felt his earlier excitement wane, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. He moved toward the center of the room, where a massive clock lay shattered on the floor, its gears and springs spilling out like entrails. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The apparition. The answer came in the form of a voice, low and rasping, as though dragged from the depths of the earth. "Why have you come here?" Liam spun around, his flashlight beam searching frantically for the source of the voice. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, coalescing into the form of a man, a tall, gaunt figure dressed in 17th century clothing. His face was pale and sharp, his eyes sunken and hollow, and his mouth curled into a cruel smile. "Time," the apparition said, its voice echoing in the confined space. "It was stolen from me. Now, I will take it back." Liam stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Who are you?" The figure stepped closer, its movements unnervingly smooth. "I am the clockmaker," it said. the architect of eternity. Michael Shaw thought he could wield my creation, but time bows to no man. Liam's legs gave out, and he fell to the floor, his breath coming in short. Panic gasps. The apparition loomed over him, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the room. "You have trespassed," it hissed. "Your time is mine." The clocks in the room began to tick, their hands spinning wildly. The cacophony grew louder and louder until it was deafening, drowning out Liam's screams. He clutched his head, his vision blurring as the air around him seemed to distort, bending and warping like the surface of a rippling pond. The search. Meanwhile, in the library, Emily glanced at her watch, 3:17 a.m., though she could have sworn it had been earlier just moments ago. The eerie coincidence wasn't lost on her. But before she could comment, Connor looked up from the journal. "Where's the tourist?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Alice snorted. "Probably off taking selfies in the turret." Emily frowned. "I don't think so. He seemed too curious. What if he found something?" Maggie, who had been pacing the library with an air of unease, stopped abruptly. "He's in trouble," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to find him. Now." The group grabbed flashlights and set off through the castle, calling Liam's name as they searched. The oppressive silence of the corridors seemed to swallow their voices, and the shadows stretched and twisted with each flicker of their lights. It was Emily who found the hidden passage. Her fingers brushed against the same loose stone, and the wall slid open to reveal the dark tunnel. The cold air that rushed out sent a chill down her spine. "He's in there," Maggie said, her voice a whisper. The group entered the passage, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. When they emerged into the chamber, the sight before them stopped them in their tracks. Liam was sprawled on the floor, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He was clutching a broken pocket watch, its chain wrapped tightly around his fingers. The clocks around the room were still ticking, their hands spinning in chaotic patterns. Emily rushed to Liam's side, shaking him gently. "Liam, are you okay?" He blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. "The clockmaker," he murmured. He said my time." "What does that mean?" Connor asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the apparition appeared once more, materializing from the shadows like smoke. Its hollow eyes scanned the group, its expression devoid of mercy. "Time is a gift," it said, "and a curse. Those who tamper with it must pay the price." The warning. Maggie stepped forward, her hand raised in a gesture of defiance. "You're bound to this place," she said. "You can't harm us outside of your prison." The apparition smiled, a cold, lifeless expression. "Perhaps not," it said, "but your time here is finite, and you are running out." The clocks chimed in unison, their tones discordant and haunting. The apparition dissolved, leaving the group alone in the chamber. The ticking slowed and eventually stopped, plunging the room into silence once more. Liam sat up shakily, his hands still trembling. "We have to leave," he said, his voice barely audible. He won't let us go." Emily helped him to his feet, her mind racing. The clockmaker's cryptic words hung heavy in the air, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they had only begun to understand the true danger of Ballygally Castle. As they made their way back to the library, the shadows of the castle seemed darker, the air heavier, and somewhere, faint and rhythmic, the ticking of a clock began once more.